The dust of Creekwood, Texas, was a fine, red powder that coated everything. The prickly pear cactus, the corrugated metal roofs of the newly built barracks, and the tired, worn faces of the women who stumbled out of the covered army trucks. It was the summer of 1945, and the war in Europe was over, yet for these women, the fighting for dignity had just begun. Liesl Braun straightened her back, adjusting the ill-fitting, faded military jacket she still wore. She was just 23, but the war had given her the eyes of a woman twice her age, clear, ice blue, and unnervingly steady. She wasn't a frontline infantry soldier. She had been a capable auxiliary, running vital communications and logistics for the Luftwaffe. But here, behind the tall chain-link fence of Camp Harmony, she was just another German prisoner of war, a Frau who was not supposed to be here. The camp was designed quickly, converted from a civilian conservation corps site. It wasn't the freezing, muddy pit she had expected. The barracks were sparse but clean, each cot holding a mattress. The washrooms had running water, hot even. Liesl had arrived expecting degradation, perhaps starvation, the kind of brutal treatment the propaganda back home had promised. Instead, she found an eerie, confusing sense of order. A handful of American guards, mostly older men and a few young soldiers who hadn't seen action, watched them. They didn't sneer, but their eyes were heavy with suspicion and sometimes outright mockery. The officer in charge, Captain Thomas Miller, stood a few feet away, his jaw tight beneath the brim of his cap. Captain Miller was a man of strict routine and deep caution. He had spent his war managing inventory in Oklahoma, and now he was tasked with managing a new, unexpected contingent, 73 German female prisoners. In his mind, these women were soldiers, capable of anything. He saw them not as tired girls, but as dangerous, indoctrinated enemies. As Liesl stepped forward to report her name and rank, her posture, ramrod straight, shoulders back, only intensified Miller's distrust. Name? Captain Miller clipped, not looking up from his clipboard. Braun. Liesl, auxiliary sergeant, she replied, her English correct, though heavily accented. Miller looked up, his skepticism hardening his gaze. Sergeant? A little girl playing soldier, is that it? A few of the guards chuckled, a low, ugly sound. Liesl didn't flinch. She had faced bombs and men with guns. Mockery was a feather. Sir, I followed my oath and performed my duty. Just as you do. The reply was too measured, too direct. It didn't sound like the response of a defeated prisoner. It sounded like a challenge. Miller felt a spike of anger. He hated that she looked him in the eye, and he hated that she carried herself with such dignity despite the surrender. Your duty now, Sergeant Braun, Miller said, leaning in slightly, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, is to follow my orders. This isn't Germany. You have no rank here. You are a prisoner. Remember that. He turned to his lead sergeant, a massive older man named Johnson who usually ran the supply depot. Sergeant Johnson, show these women their mess hall. And watch this one. She looks like trouble. Johnson, a kind-faced man with a drooping mustache, gave a curt nod and ushered the women toward the barracks. As they walked past, one of the younger guards whispered loudly to his partner, "Look at the way they eat. Like they haven't seen a proper meal in a year, probably starving them back home." It was true. The previous night's meal, a simple stew with real meat, potatoes, and white bread, had been a feast compared to the thin soup and stale rye rations Liesl remembered. As the women filed into the barracks, Liesl finally allowed her eyes to sweep the camp. The beds were made, the sheets were clean, and in the distance, she could see a baseball game starting between two shifts of American guards. The stark contrast was a confusing weight on Liesl's chest. The American hatred was palpable, etched on the face of Captain Miller. But the physical reality of the camp, the safety, the clean water, the full mess hall, was an unexpected, bewildering sanctuary. Later that evening, after the first full hot meal, Liesl lay on her cot. She looked at a small water-stained letter she had smuggled in her boot lining, the last one from her mother. It spoke of cold, of rationing, and of the paralyzing fear of the advancing Russian troops. Liesl closed her eyes. She was a captive, yes. She was insulted and despised, but she was warm. She was fed, and for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't listening for the whistle of a siren or the crump of distant artillery. Captain Miller saw defiance in her steady gaze. What he missed was the deep, terrified relief she felt. She had survived the horror of the war, only to find that the worst part, the coming famine, the shattered homeland, might still be waiting for her. And suddenly the walls of the prison camp didn't feel like walls at all. They felt like a shield. The irony was heavy and unsettling. She was an enemy, but she was safer here than she would be anywhere else in the world. This was the first terrifying truth she had to guard. The rhythm of camp harmony was defined by bells, whistles, and the grating sound of the American guards' boots on the dusty paths. Liesel, along with the other 72 Frauen, quickly realized that routine was their new currency. It bought them silence, space, and a certain minimal respect. The women assigned themselves to groups based on old friendships and shared experiences. Liesel, because of her sharp mind and unwavering composure, naturally became the unofficial leader of her barrack, Barrack C. She didn't seek the role, but the others, younger and more easily frightened, looked to her for guidance. She established a silent code: obey the letter of the law, but never sacrifice dignity. They would work, but they would not crawl. Their assigned task was massive: a laundry and mending operation for all the surrounding U.S. Army bases. It was back-breaking labor, hot, humid, and endless. But Liesel saw it as a purpose that kept them from thinking too deeply about the letters arriving from Europe. During the first week, Captain Miller decided to test Liesel's compliance. He walked into the laundry tent, the air thick with steam and soap, and demanded to see the daily count sheets. "Sergeant Braun," he barked, deliberately using her old rank in a mocking way. "The count is short by 300 towels. Explain." Liesel, her hands raw from the lye soap, stood perfectly still. The other women froze. The slightest sign of rebellion meant punishment, loss of meal privileges, perhaps. "Captain," Liesel said calmly, her voice echoing in the wet tent, "the count is not short. We were provided 2,100 towels. We have returned 2,100 towels, washed, ironed, and folded. The supply sergeant, Mr. Johnson, signed the receipt 2 minutes ago." Miller frowned. He checked his clipboard. The number was correct. He had deliberately cited the wrong intake figure, trying to provoke a reaction, a burst of anger or confusion. Liesel had countered him not with emotion, but with facts and documented procedure. Miller, irritated, snapped, "Don't waste my time. Get back to work." He stalked out, but the seeds of doubt were planted. She wasn't an indoctrinated fanatic. She was a highly organized logistics expert. The incident was small, but it solidified Liesel's standing. The women trusted her. She was their shield against the Americans' contempt. Liesel's strength, however, was not just in her defiance. She also spotted the acts of humanity others missed. Sergeant Johnson, the kindly, massive man who handled supplies, was one of them. He was a veteran of the Great War, his service long ago, and he moved with a slow, deliberate compassion. He noticed that the women, despite their full bellies, were lacking in vitamins. One afternoon, Sergeant Johnson delivered the weekly work supplies. As he left the crates of soap and thread, he hesitated at the doorway and then set down a small, unmarked box. "Ladies," he said, his voice gruff but low, "Doctor said y'all need more color in your diet. Tell you what, I made a mistake on the inventory. Didn't mean to order 3 cases of oranges." He didn't wait for a reply. He simply tipped the box slightly, revealing a pile of bright, beautiful citrus fruit, something the women hadn't tasted in years. Then he walked away, not looking back so that he wouldn't have to see their gratitude. He was following the rules, technically. He had ordered the supplies. He was just being inefficient about where they were delivered. Liesel understood the gesture instantly. It was a risk for him. If Captain Miller saw it, Johnson could be disciplined. That evening, as the women peeled and shared the fragrant oranges, Liesel felt a strange wave of emotion, not just gratitude, but a profound understanding of the American character. They were suspicious, sometimes cruel, but they also possessed a vast, disorganized generosity. It was this strange mix of contempt and care that made the camp so confusingly tolerable. Liesel received her own letter that week, a thin, brittle piece of paper from her younger sister Inge, who was stuck in the occupied zone. Inge wrote about the hunger, the cold, and the fear. The letter, carefully censored by the American authorities, still communicated the terror. The endless waiting, the scavenged potatoes, the lack of proper shoes. Inge mentioned a neighbor who had bartered her last silver locket just for a loaf of black bread. Liesel looked down at the soft, clean cotton shift she had been issued, then at the bowl of warm, steaming oats in her hand, then back to Inge's words. Her home was an ice-cold ruin. Her prison was stable, warm, and provided 3 guaranteed meals a day. She knew then that the greatest challenge of her captivity would not be the American guards or the hard work. It would be facing the guilt of her own unexpected safety and the growing, terrifying realization that she never wanted to leave. She had a new, unspoken duty to the Frauen, not just to ensure their dignity, but to ensure their survival, even if that meant delaying their return to the tragedy that was now Germany. The weeks turned into months, and the women settled into a strange, stable routine. Liesel, applying her meticulous training, streamlined the laundry and mending operation so efficiently that even Captain Miller had to acknowledge her work. He did so indirectly, of course, by signing off on the required efficiency report without comment, which was, in Miller's world, the highest form of praise. The women were given access to a small, dusty library and allowed to organize a weekly sewing circle where they could mend their own clothes and even practice embroidery. The camp was not paradise, but it was predictable. In the shattered world of 1945, predictability was luxury. Liesel thrived on this structure. She organized an informal language exchange, helping the younger women improve their English, and in turn, she learned more about American culture from the occasional, nervous conversations with the support staff. She learned about baseball, about Hollywood movies, and about a kind of civilian freedom that felt utterly alien after years of total war. But the letters from home became worse. The news from the Soviet-occupied zones, where many of the women had families, was especially grim, not just of scarcity but of chaos. The American censors tried to black out the most distressing sections, but enough was left to paint a picture of total collapse, shattered infrastructure, roving gangs, and a winter of certain starvation. One afternoon, Liesel was reading a letter for a younger woman, Helga, whose hands shook too violently to hold the paper. The letter from Helga's aunt said simply, "The fields are burned. We have nothing left but the house frame. Do not hurry home." Helga burst into silent, wrenching sobs. Liesel held her tightly. The words were a warning, a desperate plea hidden beneath cautious language. It was this creeping terror, this fear of repatriation, that became the new, unseen barbed wire around the camp. The women were POWs, but they were being held safe from the wreckage of their own country. The physical comforts, the crisp sheets, the regular doctor's visits, the surprisingly good food, ceased to be pleasantries. They became evidence. Captain Miller, still deeply suspicious of Liesel, began to notice a pattern he couldn't explain. His job was to maintain security, but his camp was experiencing the lowest infraction rate of any facility in the state. The women weren't trying to escape. They were desperately trying to stay put. He watched Liesel. He saw her competence, yes, but now he saw something else. He saw her sitting with the distressed women, calmly reading the grim letters, then quietly taking them to the camp doctor to ask about extra rations of vitamin C for the stress. She wasn't inciting rebellion. She was practicing command care. One day, Miller's commanding officer, Colonel Hayes, visited the camp. He was a loud, impatient man focused solely on logistics and closing down the facilities as quickly as possible. "Miller, what's the delay on the initial repatriation paperwork for the female unit?" Hayes demanded, slapping the table in Miller's office. "We need these women out of the country. They're a complication. Get them processed." Miller hesitated. "Sir, they're all fully processed, but I haven't submitted the final manifest. The morale is odd, Colonel. There is no desire to return home. It's almost universal dread." Hayes laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "Dread? They're enemies, Thomas. They lost. They should be grateful we're sending them back at all. They're probably trying to stall for time, looking for a way to immigrate. Don't fall for their feminine tricks. You expedite this paperwork or I'll find someone who will. Miller felt a chill. The colonel's order was cold, hard, and final. He was a soldier, and he followed orders. But he also knew what he was seeing. He saw Liesel leading the women in a voluntary gardening project in the sweltering heat, using the fresh vegetables to augment their soup. Not because they had to, but because they understood the value of every single calorie. Miller looked at the official reports in front of him. Camp Harmony POWs. Average weight gain 8.5 lbs since arrival. Camp Harmony POW morale. Stable, cooperative. He then thought of the stack of censored letters on his desk marked Return to Sender that described villages wiped out and families scattered. He knew the paperwork was just a formality, a required step on the road back to certain privation and fear. That night, Captain Miller walked the perimeter fence, the Texas moon hanging high above the barracks. He stopped outside Barrack C and listened to the low, steady murmur of women talking, not in fear but in quiet, careful planning. Liesel was speaking, her voice low and firm. She was distributing the last of the oranges, making sure the smallest women got the biggest pieces. Miller understood the truth then. These women didn't despise his prison. They were terrified of the freedom waiting for them outside. He was ordered to send them back to the ruins of their country, a place where the life he was providing them here, simple, hard, but safe, was now a dream. And he knew with a sinking feeling that Liesel Braun, the young woman he had mocked as a little girl playing soldier, was about to fight the most important battle of her life, the battle to save her friends from going home. The tipping point arrived with Elsa. Elsa Ritter was a quiet, nervous frau in her early 20s, assigned to the kitchen detail. She was small and had always struggled with the war's psychological toll. Her desperation wasn't born of defiance but of pure terror. News had filtered into the camp, unofficially, through a careless remark by a guard, that the final repatriation list was being prepared. The date was imminent. The news hit the women like a physical blow, dissolving the fragile sense of stability they had built. Elsa reacted with silent panic. She stopped eating. She started hoarding slivers of soap and pieces of sharp metal from the industrial kitchen tools. Liesel, ever vigilant, noticed the change first. One hot, still afternoon, Liesel found Elsa behind the barracks, sobbing uncontrollably. Elsa confessed her plan. She wasn't trying to escape. She was planning to inflict a wound serious enough to land her in the camp infirmary, delaying her transfer, even if only by a few weeks. "I can't go back, Liesel," Elsa whispered, clutching a hidden dull knife. "My town is gone. My parents are gone. It is better to be sick here than to be free there." Liesel's breath hitched. This was the dark core of their reality, finally brought into the open. She didn't shout or panic. She simply placed her strong, raw hand over Elsa's, guiding the knife point away. "Give it to me, Elsa," Liesel commanded, her voice soft but absolute. "You will not hurt yourself. We will fight this with our minds, not with our bodies." Elsa resisted weakly, then finally surrendered the knife. Liesel, knowing she had to address the crisis immediately, took the knife, concealed it in her sleeve, and marched straight toward Captain Miller's office. She walked in without knocking. Captain Miller, hunched over his manifest, looked up, startled by the breach of discipline. "Sergeant Braun!" "What is the meaning of this?" "You are under detention. You will report to the guard station immediately." Liesel ignored the detention order. She walked right up to his desk, placed the dull knife down on the blotter, and held up her hands. "You must listen to me." "Captain," Liesel said, her voice shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the immense pressure of the moment. "This is not defiance. This is a matter of life. This knife belongs to a prisoner." She was not trying to escape. She was trying to delay her return home. Miller stared at the knife, then at Liesel's desperate face. The raw honesty was undeniable. "Explain yourself, Braun, clearly." "Life in Germany is worse than life in this camp, Captain," Liesel stated, the central truth finally articulated. "You call this a prison. We call it survival. We have beds, guaranteed food, and medicine. We have security. If you send us home now, we will be sent to the rubble, to starvation, and to chaos. Elsa would rather be wounded here than hungry and alone there." Miller leaned back in his chair, his initial anger replaced by a cold, sickening realization. He pulled out the weight gain reports. He looked at the medical files, which showed that every single woman was healthier now than when they arrived. Liesel's eyes, usually so defiant, were now just pleading. "You believe that being a prisoner in America is better than being a citizen in Germany?" Miller asked, his voice low. "Yes, Captain, I do," Liesel whispered. "The war is over, but the disaster is not. You have won the war, but you have saved our lives here in this place. If you send us back now, you send us back to defeat. The peace is worse than your prison." Liesel then lowered her voice further, making a direct, passionate appeal, speaking not as a soldier, but as a human being. "I am begging you, not for freedom, but for a delay. For time, we will work harder. We will sign any document. But please, give us a window to wait until the winter famine has passed. Give us a chance to survive the peace." The silence in the office was immense. Captain Miller saw not a soldier, not a prisoner, but a desperate woman making a logical plea for the survival of her unit. He saw the truth in her eyes, a truth that defied all the easy patriotism and duty he had relied on. He was ordered to send them home, but his conscience had just been ambushed by a request he couldn't simply dismiss. He looked down at the knife and knew Liesel had sacrificed her own perfect record and risked severe punishment to save her friend. This was not the act of a fanatical enemy. It was the sacrifice of a true, brave leader. Miller slowly picked up the phone. "Guard," he said into the receiver. "Cancel the detention order for Sergeant Braun. Send Nurse Andrews to Barracks C immediately. We have a medical matter. And tell the records office to hold the final repatriation manifest. I need to review the files one more time." The fight had been joined, but now it was his fight too. The next morning, Liesel was not punished. Instead, she was called back to Captain Miller's office, this time formally, as a translator and representative of the Frauen. Miller had spent the night reviewing the paperwork, comparing the women's camp medical reports with the official intelligence summaries describing the devastation in Germany. The facts backed up Liesel's plea. The average caloric intake in their home regions was dangerously low, and the immediate post-war conditions were lethal for the weak and vulnerable. Miller now faced the real enemy, bureaucracy. He was a low-ranking officer with 73 female POWs who were technically ready for release. Repatriation was an order from Washington. He couldn't stop it, but he was determined to slow it down. "Sergeant Braun," Miller began, his voice official but lacking its former contempt. "I have reviewed your statement. The request for delayed repatriation is noted, but it violates protocol. I have been ordered to expedite your return. I cannot openly defy a direct order." Liesel nodded, maintaining her steady gaze. "I understand, Captain, but you understand the truth. We are asking for a legal, documented way to express our fear. If we must go, let us go having filed a petition that explains why the prison saved us from the peace." Miller agreed. He allowed Liesel to organize the women, not for a protest, but for a formal, meticulously documented appeal. Liesel, with her organizational skills, was relentless. The women drafted a petition, written in both German and perfect English, detailing their employment records within the camp, their nutritional status, and, most importantly, the specific details from the letters they had received, describing the near-famine conditions of their hometowns. They didn't ask for asylum or immigration. They asked only for a humanitarian delay of 6 months until the next harvest. The act of writing the petitions gave the women purpose and dignity. It was a final, desperate act of civilian courage, but Miller's attempt to file the petitions through official channels was immediately shut down. His commanding officer, Colonel Hayes, flew into a rage when the documentation arrived on his desk. "This is an outrage, Miller," Hayes bellowed over the phone. "They're trying to use us. They're using our camp records as a leverage point. Shut it down. You are not running a humanitarian aid station. You are running a POW camp. Burn the petitions. Get that manifest filed and have those women on a train by the end of the week." Miller was crushed. He had seen the truth, and now he was ordered to bury it. He knew Liesel's work, her courage, and the desperate, logical argument of the Frauen would be discarded as military insubordination. He was a soldier. He had to comply. He called Liesel into his office one last time, his face grim. "Sergeant Braun, your petitions have been officially denied and ordered destroyed. The transport order is effective in 72 hours. You are to prepare your unit for departure." Liesel looked at the defeat in Miller's eyes, and she didn't accuse him or curse him. She simply asked, "Did they even read what we wrote, Captain?" "It doesn't matter," Miller replied heavily. "Protocol is protocol." At that moment, Liesel didn't feel defeated. She felt a renewed surge of clarity. She had gambled on the system's ability to recognize humanitarian truth, and the system had failed. Now she would have to rely on something else. "Thank you for the chance, Captain," Liesel said, standing to leave. She paused at the door. "We will be ready." "We always follow orders." As she walked back to the barracks, Liesel passed Sergeant Johnson, the kind supply man. Johnson stopped her. He had a look of profound distress. "I heard, Liesel," he whispered, using her first name for the first time. "It ain't right. You women deserve better than what's waiting for you." "Sarge," Liesel said, looking around to ensure no one was listening, "did you keep copies of the efficiency reports I filed for the laundry? The ones that listed our daily caloric intake and weight gains?" Johnson, confused, nodded. "Sure, logistical records. Gotta keep those for 3 years." "Good," Liesel said, her eyes shining with cold determination. "Keep them safe." "Keep them very safe." Liesel returned to Barrack C. She didn't tell the women the petitions had been denied. Instead, she told them to prepare for the trip, but to do one final piece of work, to write, not petitions, but simple, truthful letters about the camp, detailed accounts of the food, the clean water, and the lack of violence, letters that praised the efficiency of Camp Harmony. She told them to leave nothing out. She was not preparing them for repatriation. She was preparing for a final act of exposure. The morning of the transport was stark and quiet. The women of Camp Harmony lined up, their few possessions bundled tightly. The mood was heavy, yet Liesel's own composure was unwavering. She moved among the women, offering quick, firm reassurances. She carried a thick ledger tucked under her arm, an official-looking book she had kept for the camp's supplies, filled with what appeared to be innocuous inventory counts. Captain Miller stood by the truck, supervising the loading, his face carved from stone. He was angry at his superiors, disappointed in the failure of the system, and sickened by the task he was completing. He looked at Liesel, expecting defiance, perhaps a final futile protest. As Liesel reached the truck, she paused in front of Captain Miller. She did not salute. She merely held his gaze, her ice-blue eyes conveying a deep, powerful understanding. "Captain Miller," Liesel said, her voice clear enough for the surrounding guards and the Frauen to hear. "I want to thank you for the food, for the doctor, for the safety you provided us." She then held out the ledger, but before Miller could take it, she opened it, revealing the final pages. They weren't inventory sheets. They were the concise, bulleted, signed summaries of the women's desperation, a final report comparing the average daily meal provided at Camp Harmony, 2,500 calories, with the estimated intake in Munich and Dresden, 900 calories, cross-referenced with the medical data showing the women were now fit to survive the journey, having gained back the weight of the war. "I have kept detailed records." "Captain," Liesel stated, her voice tight with suppressed emotion, "this is the truth. We were not trying to exploit your country. We were trying to avoid returning to our own funeral. We came here thin and sick. You are sending us back strong enough to survive the famine. That is your sacrifice, Captain. You gave us the strength to fight for our survival back home. It was not a threat. It was an act of profound, challenging respect." She handed him the book. "Do with the truth what you must," Liesel finished, then turned and climbed onto the back of the truck, joining the others. The truck doors closed. Captain Miller stood rooted to the spot, the ledger heavy in his hands. He was ordered to suppress the truth, but Liesel had just placed the weight of 73 women's futures directly into his conscience. He had two choices: destroy the book and save his career, or expose the truth and potentially ruin himself. As the truck pulled away, kicking up a final cloud of red Texas dust, Miller didn't move toward the incinerator. He walked straight into his office, closing the door behind him. The twist, the justice of sacrifice. Captain Miller sat down and looked at the ledger. He knew he couldn't just give the original to Colonel Hayes. It would be destroyed, and Liesel's sacrifice would be meaningless. Instead, he pulled out his own personal typewriter and began to type, copying Liesel's meticulous report, adding a cover letter of his own. He didn't leak it to the press himself. He used the network he had built through Sergeant Johnson, the quiet, decent American who ran the supplies. Johnson had a cousin who worked for a major humanitarian aid organization based in New York. Miller sent a sealed, registered package containing Liesel's report, his own cover letter describing the humanitarian dilemma at Camp Harmony, and copies of the American medical records proving the women's improved health. He sent it not to the military, but to the aid organization, ensuring it went directly to an entity whose mission was to expose such injustices. Within 3 weeks, Miller was relieved of his command. Colonel Hayes used administrative inefficiency and unauthorized correspondence with civilian entities as the pretext. Miller accepted the demotion without protest. His act of disobedience cost him his career advancement, but he knew what he had done. Meanwhile, Liesel and the women were shipped across the Atlantic. The journey was grim, but Liesel kept them strong, constantly repeating the logistics of survival, focus on the small details, conserve energy, prepare for the worst. When they finally arrived in the shattered port of Hamburg, Germany, stepping onto a dock of rubble and smoke, the sight was even worse than the letters had described. The reality of starvation was immediate and terrifying. Liesel, her heart sinking with the weight of defeat, felt the emptiness of her sacrifice. They were home, but they were homeless. But as they were being processed by the local authorities, a young aid worker, a woman in a crisp uniform from a neutral country, approached Liesel. She didn't speak German, but she carried a folded, black and white newspaper clipping from a major American paper. She pointed to the headline, "POW camp commander demoted after exposing German women's plea to stay, claims prison life is survival." Beneath the headline was a direct quote, attributed anonymously to an impartial camp official, detailing the caloric comparisons and the desperate letters. The article wasn't just news. It was a call to action, demanding that Allied forces adjust repatriation schedules based on documented humanitarian need. Liesel looked at the photo of the dateline, Creekwood, Texas. She realized Captain Miller hadn't saved her from the journey, but he had given her the ultimate justice. He had believed her truth, sacrificed his career for her testimony, and exposed the lie of immediate necessary repatriation. He had honored her courage. Liesel Braun straightened her shoulders, tucking the clipping safely away. The war was lost, the peace was deadly, but now, a small, tiny sliver of hope, the result of her strength and Miller's sacrifice, was shining through the darkness. She was back in the ruins, but she was armed with the truth. Her journey to justice was not over. It had just begun. The dignity she had fought for was not in staying put, but in changing the world she was forced to return to.